Chapter 24. My brother was murdered. On Friday morning, Frankie's car stopped outside the station hotel at Ambledeva. She had sent a telegram to Bobby, telling him that she would have to attend the inquest on Henry Bassington French and would stop and see him on the way down from London. She had expected a telegram in reply, but nothing had come.
"Yes, miss,"
said the hotel receptionist.
"Mr. Jones came here on Wednesday evening. He left his bag and said he mightn't be in till late. He hasn't been back."
Frankie felt sick. "Did he leave any message?" The man shook his head.
"Anything I can do, miss?"
Frankie shook her head. She must have time to think about what to do next. The inquest took place at Merroway Court. Roger was there and Sylvia, looking very beautiful in her black suit. The verdict was suicide while of unsound mind, just as the verdict in John Savage's death had been. Two suicides while of unsound mind, thought Frankie. Could there be a connection? Frankie and Dr. Nicholson stayed behind after everyone else left. "I think there are some letters for you, Frankie dear," said Sylvia. "You won't mind if I leave you and go and lie down, will you? It's been so awful." She shivered and left the room.
"That went very well," Dr. Nicholson said. "We are lucky that Dr. Davidson was our coroner."
"I suppose so," said Frankie.
"It makes a lot of difference, Lady Frances. The coroner can make things as easy or as difficult as he pleases. In this case, everything went perfectly."
"A good stage performance, in fact," said Frankie in a hard voice. Nicholson looked at her in surprise.
"I know what Lady Frances is thinking," said Roger. "My brother was murdered, Dr. Nicholson. The criminals who made my brother a slave to drugs murdered him, just as if they had shot him."
Roger's angry eyes looked straight into the doctor's.
"Somehow, I mean to make them pay for that."
Dr. Nicholson shook his head sadly.
"I agree with you, Mr. Bassington French. It is a terrible crime to persuade a man to take drugs."
He turned to Frankie.
"You came down by car, Lady Frances? No accidents this time?"
"No," she said. "I think it's a pity to have too many accidents. Don't you?" His eyebrows rose.
"Perhaps your chauffeur drove you this time?"
"My chauffeur," said Frankie, "has disappeared. He was last known to be heading for the Grange."
"Really?"
Nicholson's voice sounded amused.
"I can't believe it. Possibly you are paying too much attention to local gossip. It is very unreliable. I even heard a story that my wife and your chauffeur had been seen talking together down by the river, Lady Frances."
"Is that his plan?" thought Frankie. "Is he going to pretend that his wife has gone away with my chauffeur?" Nicholson turned to Roger.
"I must be going. Believe me, all my sympathies are with you and Mrs. Bassington French."
Roger went out into the hall with him. Frankie followed. On the hall table were a couple of letters addressed to her. One was from her father. The other was in Bobby's handwriting. She tore it open. "Dear Frankie, follow me as soon as possible to Chipping Somerton. Come by train. The Bentley is too noticeable. Come to a house called Tudor Cottage. I've put instructions on how to get there below. Don't tell anyone at all. Yours ever, Bobby." Nothing terrible had happened to Bobby, and he was going to the place she had intended them to go to together, because she had been to Somerset House to look up the will of John Savage, and in it Mrs. Templeton, Rose Templeton, was said to be the wife of Edgar Templeton of Tudor Cottage, Chipping Somerton. They were reaching the end of the play. It was getting dark, and just beginning to rain when Frankie's train arrived at the little station of Chipping Somerton. Frankie buttoned her coat to her neck and set off. She saw the lights of the village ahead, and following the instructions Bobby had sent, turned left onto a narrow road that went uphill. At the top, she took the right-hand path and soon saw the pine trees Bobby had described. Finally, she came to a gate and, lighting a match, saw Tudor Cottage written on it. Her heart began beating a little faster when she saw the door open and a figure in a chauffeur's uniform look cautiously out. Bobby. He waved his hand for her to come and then went back inside. Frankie came up to the door. Everything was dark and silent. "Bobby?" she whispered as she stepped inside. Strong arms grabbed her, and a wet cloth was put over her mouth. The smell of chloroform filled her nose. She fought desperately, twisting and turning. Then everything went black. Chapter 25. At the 11th Hour. When Frankie woke up, she was lying on a hard wooden floor, and her hands and feet were tied. She heard a human sound and looked about her. She seemed to be in the attic room at the top of the cottage. The only light came from a window in the roof, and there was little of that. In a few minutes, it would be quite dark. There were a few broken pictures lying against the wall and some broken chairs. The sound had come from the corner. Frankie managed a sideways movement across the floor. "Bobby!" Bobby was also tied up. In addition, he had a cloth tied round his mouth, which he had almost succeeded in getting loose. Frankie helped him by pulling at the cloth with her teeth. When it came off, Bobby said, "Frankie!" "I'm glad we're together," said Frankie, "but it does look as though we've been idiots. Did they kidnap you after you wrote to me?" "I never wrote," Bobby said. "I was hit on the head at the Grange and woke up here." Frankie told him her adventures. "And then they chloroformed me," she finished. "We've got to get out of here, Frankie. Your wrists are more loosely tied than mine. Let's see if I can undo them with my teeth." Bobby spent the next 5 minutes struggling with the rope round Frankie's wrists. Then she said, "There's someone coming." She rolled away from him. Heavy footsteps could be heard coming up the stairs. A key turned in the lock, and the door opened.
"And how are my 2 little birds?"
said the voice of Dr. Nicholson. He carried a candle and was wearing a hat pulled down over his eyes, glasses, and a heavy overcoat with the collar turned up so they couldn't see his face. He shook his head at them.
"I am surprised, my dear young lady, that you fell into the trap so easily. Let me see if you are comfortable."
He examined Bobby's ropes and passed on to Frankie. He shook his head.
"Your young friend's teeth, I see, have been active."
Nicholson picked up Frankie, sat her on a chair, and tied her to it.
"Not too uncomfortable, I hope," he said. "Well, it isn't for long."
"What are you going to do with us?" she demanded.
"You taunted me, Lady Frances, with being too fond of accidents. I am going to risk one more. Lady Frances Derwent, driving her car, her chauffeur beside her, takes a wrong turning. The car crashes over the edge of a cliff. Lady Frances and her chauffeur are killed."
"He's enjoying this," thought Bobby. "Really enjoying it." Nicholson turned to the door. "What about your wife?" cried Bobby. "Have you murdered her too?"
"Moira is still alive," said Nicholson. "How much longer she remains so depends on what happens in the next few hours."
He smiled unpleasantly.
"Goodbye, for now. It will take me a couple of hours to complete my arrangements."
He went out and locked the door behind him. "Frankie," said Bobby, "that wasn't Nicholson. Have you gone mad? It wasn't Nicholson, Frankie. At the Grange, I watched through a window while Nicholson worked at his desk. I noticed that his ears were small and laid flat against his head. That man's ears weren't like that. This is a very clever actor impersonating Nicholson." "But why? And who?" "Roger Bassington French," said Bobby. "Bassington French," whispered Frankie. "Bobby, you're right. He was the only person there when I taunted Nicholson about accidents." "He's been too clever for us, Frankie," said Bobby. "Moira's a prisoner. You and I are tied hand and foot, and nobody else has any idea where we are." The next minute, with a loud crash, a body fell through the roof window, and from among a pile of broken glass, a voice spoke. "Bobby!" "Gosh," said Bobby. "It's Badger." Chapter 26. Badger's Story. There was not a minute to be lost. Already sounds could be heard on the floor below. "Quick, Badger," said Bobby. "Pull one of my boots off. Put it down in the middle of the broken glass and crawl under that bed. Quick!" Steps were coming up the stairs. The key turned. Bassington French stood in the doorway. He stared in amazement, from the broken window to the boot, to Bobby's bootless left foot.
"I can hardly believe it, my young friend,"
he said.
"Extremely acrobatic."
He examined the ropes that bound Bobby, then looked at him curiously.
"I wish I knew how you manage that."
Then, shaking his head, he left the room. Badger crawled out from under the bed. He had a small pocket knife, and soon cut the other two free. "That's better," said Bobby, stretching his arms. "Well, Frankie, what about our friend Nicholson?" "You're right," said Frankie. "Now that I know he's Roger Bassington French, I can see it. But it's a pretty good performance all the same." "I was at Oxford with a Bassington French," said Badger. "Marvellous actor. Bad man, though. He forged his father's name on a cheque." "Forgery," said Frankie thoughtfully. "That letter from you, Bobby, was really well done." "What are we going to do next?" Badger asked. "We're going to go behind this door," said Bobby, "and when our friend returns, you and I are going to give him the surprise of his life. How about it, Badger? Are you ready?" "Oh, yes." "Now, how did you get here, and why did you fall through the window?" "Well, you see," said Badger, "after you went off, I had some problems." The story was a typical Badger tale of having no money and of someone demanding that he paid a bill. Bobby had gone away, leaving no address, just saying that he was driving the Bentley down to Staveley. So, to Staveley came Badger. "I thought perhaps you might be able to let me have £5, he explained. Badger had come across the Bentley parked outside a pub, empty. "So, I thought I'd give you a surprise. There were some blankets on the back seat, and there was nobody about. I got in and pulled them over me." A chauffeur had come out of the pub, and Badger, looking out from his hiding place, was amazed to see that this was not Bobby. Badger did not know what to do next. Explanations and apologies to the driver would be difficult, so Badger decided to lie still and get himself out of the car without being seen when it stopped. The car reached Tudor Cottage, and the chauffeur drove it into the garage and left it there. There was a small window in the garage, and through this, Badger had seen Frankie arrive and go into the house. When he realized that there were no lights in the house, Badger began to suspect something was wrong. He decided to have a look round. The windows on the ground floor all had their curtains closed, but he thought that by getting onto the roof, he might manage to have a look into the windows there. He got up onto the garage roof and from there to the roof of the cottage. Then, when he had knelt down to look in the attic window, he'd slipped and fallen on the glass. Bobby took in a long breath. "If it wasn't for you, Badger, my friend Frankie and I would have been murdered. It must have been Bassington French you saw, dressed up in my chauffeur's uniform, and pretending to be me so that no one would realize I'd disappeared." He gave Badger a short explanation of what he and Frankie had been doing. Then he said, "Someone's coming." Badger and Bobby hid behind the door, and as Bassington French came into the room, they jumped on him. A few seconds later, the three friends stood looking down with pleasure at a man who was securely tied up. "Good evening, Mr. Bassington French," said Bobby. "How nice to see you again." Chapter 27. Escape. The man on the floor spoke.
"Very interesting," he said. "I really knew that no man tied up as you were could have thrown a boot through that window. But because the boot was there among the broken glass, I assumed that, though it was impossible, the impossible had been achieved. So, this is most unexpected. I thought I'd got you all fooled nicely."
"So you had," said Frankie. "You forged that letter from Bobby, I suppose?"
"I did,"
said Roger, smiling. "And the letter from Moira?" demanded Bobby. Roger laughed.
"Forgery is a very useful art."
"You pig," said Bobby. Frankie was curious. "Why did you pretend to be Dr. Nicholson?" she asked.
"For the fun of seeing whether I could fool you both. You were so very sure that poor old Nicholson was the evil criminal, Lady Francis." He laughed. "Just because he questioned you in his serious way."
"And really," said Frankie slowly, "he was quite innocent. There's one thing you must tell me. I've been driven nearly mad with curiosity. Who is Evans?"
"Oh," said Bassington French. "So you don't know that." He laughed and laughed again. "That shows what a fool one can be."
"Meaning us?" asked Frankie.
"No," said Roger, "meaning me. And if you don't know who Evans is, I don't think I will tell you."
Somehow, even though Bassington French was tied up and a prisoner, it was he who seemed to control the situation.
"And what are your plans now?" he asked.
Bobby said something about the police.
"Much the best thing to do," said Roger cheerfully. "They will charge me with kidnap, I suppose. I can't very well deny that."
He looked at Frankie.
"I will use love as my excuse."
Frankie's face reddened. "What about murder of Alan Carstairs?" she asked.
"My dear, you haven't any evidence."
"We'd better go downstairs together," Bobby said. "We don't know how many more of the gang are in the house, and we'd better look into the bedrooms first." 3 bedrooms were empty. In the 4th, a slim figure was lying unconscious on the bed. "It's Moira!" cried Frankie. "She's drugged." A syringe lay on a table near the window. "We ought to get a doctor." The telephone was in the hall below. They got through to the police station, and 10 minutes later, a car arrived with an inspector, a uniformed policeman, and an elderly doctor. Bobby led the way upstairs to the attic, then stood, extremely surprised, in the doorway. A chair had been placed on the bed, which had been dragged underneath the broken window. There was no sign of Roger Bassington French. Chapter 28. Frankie asks a question. Exhausted by her adventures, Frankie slept late the next morning. It was 10:30 when she came down to the lounge of the station hotel to find Bobby waiting for her. "Hello, Frankie. Here you are at last."
"Don't be so horribly energetic. What is the matter with you?"
"I feel absolutely full of energy," said Bobby. "I've been with Inspector Hammond for the last half hour, and he seems to think we've been playing some kind of joke. So we've got to find out exactly what's been going on. We want Roger Bassington French for murder."
"And we'll get him," said Frankie, feeling better. "How's Moira?"
"Feeling very bad. She's gone up to London, to a nursing home. She says she'll feel safe there. Now, Frankie, the start of the whole thing must be John Savage's death and his will, and it's quite likely that it's a forgery. That seems to be Bassington French's speciality."
"I made notes after looking at the will at Somerset House," said Frankie. "The witnesses who'd signed it were Rose Chudley, cook, and Albert Mere, gardener. Then there are the lawyers who wrote it, Elford and Lee, whose offices are here."
"Right. I think you'd better visit the lawyers, Frankie. I'll go to see Rose Chudley and Albert Mere."
They met again at lunch.
"Well?" asked Bobby.
Frankie shook her head.
"Mr. Elford is lovely, but he was horrified at even the suggestion of forgery. He said Mr. Savage insisted on the will being written in front of him, and then Mr. Elford watched him sign it, and the servants signed their names to say they had witnessed it."
"That says it's not forgery," agreed Bobby. "And Albert Mere is dead, of natural causes. He was 72. Rose Chudley left the Templetons and went to the north of England, but then she came back and married a man down here. Unfortunately, she's a really stupid woman. Perhaps you could do something with her."
Rose Chudley, now Mrs. Pratt, lived in a small cottage which was full of ornaments.
"We were interested to hear that you were with Mrs. Templeton for some time," explained Frankie.
"I wouldn't say that, miss. Only 2 months.
"Oh, I thought you'd been with her longer."
"That was Gladys, miss, the maid. She was there 6 months. I was the cook."
"You were there when Mr. Savage died, weren't you?"
"Oh, yes, miss."
"And you had to witness his will, didn't you?"
Mrs. Pratt didn't understand.
"You saw him sign a paper, and you signed it too."
A look of something like intelligence passed across Mrs. Pratt's face.
"Yes, miss, me and Albert. I'd never done such a thing before."
"Who called you to sign your name?" asked Frankie.
"The mistress. She came into the kitchen and asked if I would go outside and call Albert, and would we both come up to the best bedroom. We did, and there was the gentleman sitting up in bed. He'd come back from London and gone straight to bed, and a very ill-looking gentleman he was. I hadn't seen him before, but he looked terrible. I signed my name, and I went down to Gladys and said I'd never seen a gentleman look so like death. And Gladys said he'd looked all right the night before."
And Mr. Savage, the gentleman, died when?
Next morning, miss. When Gladys went in to take him his tea, he was all stiff and dead. And then about 2 months later, Mrs. Templeton told me she was going abroad to live. But she got me a very good job up north, and she gave me a nice present. A very nice lady, Mrs. Templeton.
Frankie rose.
Well, she said, it's been very good to hear all this.
She took a £5 note out of her purse.
You must let me leave you a little present. I've taken up so much of your time.
Well, thank you kindly, miss.
Frankie went, and Bobby followed her after a few minutes, looking thoughtful.
Did anything about that conversation seem strange to you? He asked.
Only one thing, Frankie replied. Why did Mrs. Templeton send for the gardener to come and witness the will when the maid was in the house? Why didn't they ask the maid?
I stayed behind to ask Mrs. Pratt for Gladys's name and address.
Bobby's voice sounded so strange that Frankie looked at him in surprise.
She didn't have her address, but her name...
Well?
The maid's name was Evans.
Chapter 29. Evans. Frankie stared at him in surprise. Bobby's voice rose excitedly.
You see, you've asked the same question that Carstairs asked. Why didn't they ask the maid? Why didn't they ask Evans? So Carstairs must have thought exactly the same thing. He was investigating just as we are. Evans is a Welsh name, so Gladys was probably a Welsh girl. He was following her to Marchbolt. He didn't know that someone was following him.
Why didn't they ask Evans? Said Frankie. There must be a reason.
Suddenly, she looked at her friend with excitement.
Bobby, if you're staying in a house, you never see the cook because she is in the kitchen all the time and she never sees you. But a maid serves you at dinner. They couldn't have Evans witnessing that will because Evans would have known that it wasn't Mr. Savage who was making it.
But Frankie, who was it then?
Bassington French, of course. It was Bassington French who went to that doctor and made all that fuss about having cancer. Then the lawyer was sent for, a stranger who doesn't know Mr. Savage, but who will be able to swear that he saw Mr. Savage sign that will. And it's witnessed by 2 people, one of whom hadn't seen him before, and the other an old man who probably had never seen Savage either.
But where was the real Savage?
Oh, I suspect they drugged him and kept him in the attic while Bassington French pretended to be him. Then he was put back in his bed and given the sleeping drug, and Evans finds him dead in the morning.
Gosh, I believe you're right, Frankie. But can we prove it? We must find Evans.
Frankie groaned.
That's going to be difficult.
How about the post office? Suggested Bobby.
They were just passing it, and they went inside. There was no one in the shop except the postmistress, a young woman. Frankie bought a book of stamps, spoke about the weather, and then said,
But I expect you always have better weather here than we do in my part of the world. I live in Wales, Marchbolt. You wouldn't believe the rain we have there.
The young woman said that they had a good deal of rain themselves, and it had rained nearly every day in April. Frankie said,
There's someone in Marchbolt who comes from this part of the world. I wonder if you know her. Her name was Evans, Gladys Evans.
Why, of course, the young woman said.
She was the maid at Tudor Cottage, but she went back to Wales and got married. Roberts is her name now. That's right, said Frankie. You can't give me her address, I suppose. I borrowed a raincoat from her and forgot to give it back. If I had her address, I'd post it to her. Well now, the other replied, I believe I can. I get a postcard from her now and again. She and her husband have got jobs in the same house. Wait a minute now. She went away and returned with a piece of paper. Here you are, she said. Bobby and Frankie read it together. It was the last thing in the world they expected. Mrs. Roberts, The Vicarage, Marchbolt, Wales. Chapter 30. Sensation in the Orient Cafe. Outside the post office, Bobby and Frankie looked at each other and laughed.
She's been working at my father's vicarage all the time, said Bobby. Now I see why Bassington French was so amused. Come on, Marchbolt's the next place for us.
Wait a minute, said Frankie. We must get Badger's business sorted out. After all, he did save my life. She opened her bag and took out a handful of £5 notes. Give these to him, and tell him to pay the people he owes money to, and that Father will buy the garage and put him in as manager.
All right, said Bobby. I'll deal with Badger. You go and get the car.
5 minutes later, they were driving out of Chipping Somerton. It was getting late when they stopped outside the vicarage gate. A slim figure was standing on the doorstep.
Moira! cried Frankie. What on earth are you doing here?
The same thing that has brought you, I expect.
You have found out who Evans is? asked Bobby.
Moira nodded. Let's go somewhere and talk. There's something I must tell you before we go into the house.
All right,
said Bobby, moving unwillingly away from the door.
But why?
Moira stamped her foot impatiently. You'll see when I tell you. Oh, do come. There's not a minute to lose. They gave in. About halfway down the main street was the Orient Cafe. The three of them went in and sat down at a table in the corner. A tired waitress brought them coffee.
Now then, Bobby said.
I hardly know where to begin, said Moira. But in the train going to London, I went along the corridor and... She stopped. Her seat faced the door and she leant forward, staring outside. He must have followed me, she said.
Who?
Said Frankie and Bobby together.
Bassington French,
whispered Moira.
He's outside.
I saw him with a woman with red hair.
Mrs. Cayman,
said Frankie. She and Bobby jumped and ran to the door. They looked up and down the street, but neither Mrs. Cayman nor Roger Bassington French were in sight. Moira joined them. Has he gone? She asked, her voice shaking. Oh, do be careful. He's dangerous. Horribly dangerous.
He can't do anything as long as we're all together, said Bobby, leading the way back to the table. Go on with what you were telling us, Moira.
He picked up his cup of coffee. Frankie, sitting down, lost her balance and fell against him, and the coffee poured over the table.
Sorry,
said Frankie. She reached across to the next table, which had glass bottles containing oil and vinegar on it. She emptied the contents of the vinegar bottle into Bobby's cup and began to pour the coffee from her cup into the now empty bottle.
Have you gone mad, Frankie? asked Bobby. What the devil are you doing?
Taking a sample of this coffee for Dr. Arbuthnot to analyse, said Frankie.
She turned to Moira.
The whole thing came to me as we stood up at the door just now. You put something in our cups when you sent us running to the door to look for Bassington French. Mrs. Nicholson, or Templeton, or whatever you like to call yourself.
Templeton? cried Bobby.
Look at her face, cried Frankie. If she denies that's who she is, then ask her to come to the vicarage and see if Mrs. Roberts recognises her or not.
Bobby did look. He saw that face, that lovely, delicate face, changed completely,
by terrible anger. She took a pistol out of her handbag, but Bobby managed to push it upwards as she pulled the trigger, and the bullet passed over Frankie's head and buried itself in the wall of the Orient Cafe. With a wild scream, the waitress ran out into the street. "Help! Murder! Police!"
Chapter 31. Letter from South America. It was some weeks later. Frankie had just received a letter from one of the less well-known South American countries. Having read it, she passed it to Bobby. "Dear Frankie, I congratulate you. You and your young naval friend have destroyed the plans of a lifetime. Would you like to know all about it? My lady friend has told the police almost all my secrets, so telling you won't do me any harm now. Besides, I am starting life again. Roger Bassington French is now dead. I've always been a bad boy. My father covered up for me, but he sent me to Canada, where I met Moira and her gang. She was a successful criminal by the time she was 15. We decided to become a couple, but we needed money, lots of it, and I wanted Meroway Court. To begin with, Moira married Nicholson, who was coming over to live in England because the police were beginning to suspect her. She was working with her gang in the drug business. Without knowing it, Nicholson was very useful to her. Moira made several trips back to Canada, saying she was going to see her family. She travelled under various names. She was Mrs. Templeton when she met Savage. He was attracted by her, but not enough to leave her most of his money, or even give her very much. However, we made a plan. The man you know as Cayman pretended to be Moira's husband, and Savage was persuaded to come down and stay at Tudor Cottage. Then, after a time, Moira, well, you know what she did. She got the money Savage had left her and said she was going off to live abroad. In reality, she went back to Staveley and the Grange. In the meantime, I was trying to carry out my own plans. My brother Henry and young Tommy had to die so that I could inherit Meroway. I had bad luck over Tommy. A couple of accidents went wrong and he survived. In Henry's case, he had a lot of pain after he'd had an accident hunting. I got him some morphia. He took it and soon became an addict. The plan Moira and I made was that he would go to the Grange for treatment, and there he would take an overdose of morphia. Moira, of course, would be the one who would give him the drug. And then that fool Carstairs started his investigations. Savage had written to him, mentioning Mrs. Templeton, and had even enclosed a photograph of her. When Carstairs came to England and heard the news of Savage's suicide and will, the story didn't seem right to him. Savage was a hard-headed businessman, and while he might have an affair with a pretty woman, Carstairs didn't believe he would leave a huge amount of money to her and the rest to charity. The charity touch was my idea. It sounded so respectable. He decided to investigate. By chance, some friends brought him down to lunch, and he saw a picture of Moira on the piano. He recognized her as the woman in the photograph Savage had sent him, and a few days later, he went to Chipping Somerton and started to ask questions. He didn't find Rose Chudley, but he found out Evans's married name and went to Marchbolt. I followed him. A push in the mist sent him over the cliff. When I was waiting for the police to arrive, I removed anything that could identify him, then put the photograph of Mrs. Cayman in his pocket. All was going well, and then your friend Bobby upset things. Carstairs had mentioned Evans to him, and Evans was actually in service at the vicarage. We were frightened we were going to be caught. Moira followed Bobby and put some morphia into his beer when he was asleep, but the young devil survived. You can imagine the shock that Moira got when she was coming out to meet me secretly one evening and came face to face with Bobby. She was so scared she nearly fainted. Then she realized that it wasn't her he suspected, and she went along with what he was saying and made some more stories up. But the truth was that you and Bobby were a great danger to us. Henry didn't commit suicide, of course. I killed him. When I was talking to you in the garden, I realized that you were too near the truth, and that Henry had to die at once. I went straight in to deal with him. The plane that came over gave me the cover I needed. I shot him. The noise of the plane hid the sound. Then I wrote his suicide letter, wiped my fingerprints from the gun, and put the key of the study in Henry's pocket. I went out, locking the door from the outside with the dining room key, which fits both locks. Oh, and I'd placed a firework in the fireplace, which I timed to go off 4 minutes later. Everything went beautifully. You and I were in the garden together and heard the shot. A perfect suicide. And poor old Nicholson, who'd come back for a walking stick or something, was the perfect suspect. Moira went off to the cottage. We believed that Nicholson's explanation of his wife's absence would be sure to make you suspicious. And where Moira really showed her quick thinking was at the cottage. She realized from the noises from the attic that you'd got me. She quickly injected morphia into herself and lay down on the bed where you found her. After you all went down to telephone the police, she came up and cut me free. Then she went back to bed and the morphia took effect. By the time the doctor arrived, she was genuinely asleep. She was afraid you'd find Evans, and so she hurried down to Marchbolt to get rid of her, and met you just as she was about to go into the vicarage. Then her one idea was to get you both out of the way, and made the greatest mistake of her life by trying to poison you. And then at the trial, she told them all about my part in the whole thing. So, here I am starting life again, and all because of you and Bobby Jones. But I've no doubt I will be successful. Goodbye, my dear. Your affectionate enemy, Roger Bassington French. Chapter 32. News from the Vicarage. Bobby handed back the letter. Everything seems to have ended very well. Badger's being successful at the garage, thanks to your father. And also thanks to your father, I've got a marvellous job.
Is it a marvellous job? Frankie asked.
Managing a coffee estate out in Kenya. It's just the sort of thing I used to dream about. He paused. Then he said, People come out to Kenya on trips.
Quite a lot of people live out there, said Frankie.
Oh, Frankie, you wouldn't. He went red. Would you?
I would, said Frankie. I mean, I will.
I've been keen on you always, said Bobby. I used to be miserable, believing that though you liked me, you would never marry me because your father's an earl and mine's just a vicar.
I suppose that's what made you so rude that day on the golf course.
Yes, it all seemed hopeless.
Said Frankie. What about Moira?
Bobby looked uncomfortable. Her face had an effect on me, he admitted. And then, when we were tied up in that cottage and you were so brave about things, well, Moira just faded out. It was you. Only you. So wonderful, so brave."
"I wasn't feeling brave inside," said Frankie, "but I wanted you to admire me."
"I did, darling. I do. I always have. I always will. Are you sure you won't hate it out in Kenya?"
"I will adore it."
"Frankie,
"Bobby."
"If you will come in here," said the vicar, opening the door of the sitting room to bring in the members of the church who were meeting to discuss when they would next give away clothes to the poor. He shut the door immediately.
"My son, Bobby, he is, engaged to be married. A good boy, Bobby," said the vicar. "At one time, he didn't take life seriously enough, but he has improved very much lately. He is going out to manage a coffee estate in Kenya."
One church member said to another in a whisper,
"Did you see? It was Lady Frances Derwent he was kissing."
In an hour's time, the news was all over Marchbolt.